Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm Cassie. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be kicking us off. I've never used this clicker before. I don't know how to act. It's a little bit fancy for me. So if I have any technical difficulties, please have grace with me. So I just wanted to start off with some grounding. First, anytime that we talk about crime coverage, there's triggering material. And I just wanted to name that, like, if something comes up for you, that you are not alone, and it won't be wrong for you to do something to take care of yourself, whether that's get refreshments, whether that's take breaths, whether that's just giving yourself a minute, whatever it is, please take care of yourself as we have this conversation. The next thing with grounding is that, like, sometimes folks describe and define racism in different ways. And in terms of our project at Free Press, we see all forms of racial harm as a problem. And basically, it's like we would like this to be a space where we can actually talk about reducing that harm rather than debating that harm, if that makes sense. We don't have a ton of time today, so just got to be clear about that. Also, this is also a conversation that sometimes people can feel compelled to defend themselves. And really, I hope everybody just can feel safe enough to unclench, not trying to point no fingers at anybody, unless you are one of the news editors who's not taking your reporters out to lunch. I didn't know that was going to be such a hot topic at this summit. I had no idea. And I just wanted to make a joke. We're not going to call out those news editors either. But, you know, like, dang, I was like, do I have to thank Gabe for taking me to the scholars? What's going on? And also, too, it's like if we have conversations where people take something personal, then we don't get to continue the important conversations that we've been having today where people are actually breaking down what the systemic barriers are. So we want to talk about those systemic things that are happening because we want better systems and better ways to do this, and we want to be on this journey together. So Free Press is a media justice nonprofit. And we have been, Free Press has been, I've joined Free Press in 2022. But for 20 years, Free Press has been fighting the good fight on a number of fronts when it comes to our media systems, whether that's fighting for net neutrality, whether that's trying to take on corporate media control, data privacy. I work for the side of Free Press that focuses on the future of journalism. And I'm on the News Voices team, which brings together communities and journalists so that our news systems can better meet community information needs. So basically, I'm gonna get into some things that y'all mostly already know, I'm sure, or just entirely already know. But people really don't like crime coverage, like across sectors. There's actually some cross-sector opprobrium over this. Doctors don't like it. Researchers don't like it. Mental health experts aren't really fans of it. And it's because there's a preponderance of evidence and lived experience that shows that there's intensely, intensely heavy impacts on specific communities, Black and Brown communities. And I think that one thing that's important to hold is that how we do this, and it's important for us to debate this, but how we do this and who it impacts inside of news spaces is a debate. Outside of news spaces, it's not a debate. And then additionally, there's a lot of evidence that actually is talking about the impacts in a way where we should actually hold that while we as journalists often think of our work as neutral, the evidence is showing that the impacts on the communities and on the people in the stories are not actually neutral. Jim McMillan is here in the room. The Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting did a landmark study actually talking to people who were in the stories. And there was a lot that was there, but one of the pieces that really stayed with me was actually speaking to the dynamic that a lot of times there's information that's being shared in the stories that makes the people in the stories feel less safe. There's also a position paper from the American Academy of Family Physicians that talks about the connection of being exposed to violence through media and committing violence. And it's important that news media isn't to name that news media is not the only part of that story, right? We're a part of a media ecosystem that includes that true crime podcast that somebody can't get enough of, the cop shows that people love to watch, prime time. But the thing is that these narratives are in communication with each other. And we have to sort of recognize if our intentions are matching up with what actually is happening to news consumers as they ingest our work. So if we want to get to the nitty gritty of why this is, it's really a colonial story. If we're talking about early America, we're talking about a time period when African Americans were not actually considered people who were rightful news sources. We're talking about a time period where people of color were not actually considered a part of a shared community and audience. And we're talking about a time period where things might not be described the way we describe them today. So today we might actually talk about a slave revolt in terms of it being a form of resistance. It wasn't characterized like that back then. Slave revolts were repeatedly characterized as things that established Black people as dangerous, brutish, unsafe, violent. And if we're talking about where, at least on this soil, some of the crime coverage was born, we have to tell that story. And we also have to tell that story thinking about what those narratives do over time. My boss, Vanessa Maria Graber, is here. And something that she says that I think is such a great example that might really speak to the hearts of the Philadelphians in the room is that, if you are a Philly sports fan, you can't get through a single season. You can't get through half a season without hearing about how we booed Santa Claus. That happened in 1968. It was a really long time ago. And if you actually know the story, the Santa himself said he should have got booed. And to Vanessa's point, that story had happened one time, but it lives with us still. It haunts us still. How can we actually even quantify the impacts of telling a story that Black people, that Indigenous people, that Latinx people are savage, dangerous, or unsafe over centuries, innumerable times? Also, to that, it's important for us to hold that if we're actually trying to understand where it begins, that we have a dynamic where people of color are understood as a threat to public safety in the American populace at large, that happens in our news media before America is a country. And then it's reinforced over time. There's a dynamic where progress evolves and develops, but something that's a constant is this disproportionate impact on Black and brown people. So we have in the 19th century yellow journalism where actually fake accounts of Black people committing crimes are published. We have in 1908 when Mizzou actually creates the first journalism school, doing so with the white cultural values of the time and without any Black students, much less Black faculty. And of course, we know, or many of us know because of the work of Layla Jones at the Philadelphia Inquirer, about the innovations that ABC6 here in Philadelphia made to the If It Bleeds, It Leads format, and the way that that proliferated around the country. And I think it's important that in an earlier session today, someone actually brought up the business aspects of this. There's a connection. Yes, thank you for doing that. I want to lift up a quote from the media critic Janine Jackson that I carry with me, which is, journalism is a public service. Information is a public good. Media is a business. And those things aren't always in alignment on what is right? And if we don't actually open up that there's a generations long conversation about the relationship of these stories, with us knowing their disproportionate impact and the relationship with advertisers, that's really important. And sometimes that's sort of squeamish for us as journalists. Like, we ain't really trying to talk about the money, but we kind of got to talk about the money. To make an unprecedented cultural change is not light work. It's really, really serious. And every single person at the Inquirer who wants credit for that should get credit for that. This is some real, real heavy stuff and some real accomplishments. At the same time, though, it wasn't enough for the community. And why is that? So essentially, something that really is sort of like at the heart of this project is sort of dealing with a disconnect that comes up from between community and journalists. And we all know that we mean well, we all know that we work hard. But essentially, if we're actually peeling back the onion to have conversations and taking time with the evidence and speaking to the community and acknowledging that crime briefs, propaganda, regular routine practices that are in our work have life and death impacts on them. It's like the community's not gonna act like they won the Super Bowl if we say we're just gonna do fewer crime briefs at night, but we're still gonna do if it bleeds, it leads. There's not necessarily a way for the community to read that there is a commitment to reduce practices that are harmful to the community, because that's not a commitment to do that. And so I think that that is one of the things that is sort of tricky with this work. But I think that journalists can't be discouraged when the community isn't satisfied. There's a lot of work that has been done, but there's a lot more work to do if we actually want equitable systems and if we actually want new systems that support a multiracial democracy. So what is next for us? So because of all the lessons that we've learned, the things that have been going on, this is sort of where we are right now in 2024 with the work that we're holding. We're supporting journalists of color who are seeking mutual aid and accountability. We are actually launching a cohort of community members who are journalists. Some folks are interested in civic media. One of those folks is here. To actually talk and come together to foster new models when it comes to editorial standards and financial standards. We're also doing a lot of research on a project that would be on the lineage of crime coverage and its history. And we're continuing to talk to mental health experts. One of the things that is part of our work is actually, we've been doing a lot of research and collaboration with folks in the community and therapists about the ways that people who are impacted by crime coverage should be cared for. And we also are having conversations about the ways that journalists should be cared for, because it doesn't get named enough that this is extremely, extremely difficult work that leaves a real lasting impact on us and the folks here in this room as well. So that's where we are. And thank you so much for listening to my long, winding presentation. Thank y'all.
Well, first off, I'm not going to be nearly that eloquent or prepared. Want to start with a couple of things. The first thing is journalism is not objective. The way we do our jobs should be objective. But we carry all of our life's experiences, where we're from, who we've been with, who we hang out with, what we've seen with us. And all of us can sit back and say, we've got editors who have actually seen things and have different perspectives and think that a story is a good one when you think it's a piece of crap. That's because subjectively, we carry our life's experiences with us, so we need to stop the bullshit on it's objective, because it's not. we also need to actually sit back, and I'll give you an example. And I'm going to be dating myself, and Kevin probably remembers this. During the LA riots, USA Today had the biggest fight over what the front page story was supposed to be after the second verdict in that case. And we ran a photo of a police officer bringing flowers to, was it somebody from the neighborhood or was it one of us? But they had brought flowers to, and the story was about how do the police come back from this? The story that I wanted to do was everybody's gone home. We've all taken our cameras, but the problems are still here. That was a different perspective because I had been hanging out in South Central and seeing the problems. And everything was still boarded up. It was still blighted. It was still a high unemployment rate, those kinds of things. But the perspective that we ended up going with was the perspective of editors who did not look like me and who had not been in any of the places I'd been in. So I want to get that subjectivity and objectivity thing out there right now. I've been doing this for 43 years. I've been a police reporter in Louisiana. I was a police reporter in Washington, D.C., which was kind of PhD, because it was back during the crack cocaine years when I was covering at least 1 to 2 homicides every day, and we were trying to cover them. I've done it also at USA Today where when Kevin and I actually showed up someplace, if we showed up in your town, it wasn't good for your town, because we never showed up for anything good. And we could go to Waco, Oklahoma City, LA riots, TWA 800, you kind of get the picture, Columbine. So then I moved on to the Journal and just kind of did it at a different level with the Justice Department. And now at AP, they've moved me over to politics, which I thought would be less of a shit show, but obviously I missed. So we will start with, when I started this, we took police reports and statements from lawyers and from prosecutors as the gospel. You know, if you went and looked at the arrest book and somebody had been booked, you just assume, well, they got the right person. They must be guilty. You hear somebody say, I didn't do it, like, yeah, right, you didn't do it. We took it as the gospel because we didn't think anybody had ulterior motives, and we weren't asking the next question, which is, so why are you leaking to me that you're going to arrest this guy if you haven't arrested him? Why are you leaking to me that there's an indictment pending on this guy? I'd rather see the indictment first. Why are you talking to me? We didn't question that in my age group. I think you guys are probably a lot more savvy than we were because you've seen more. Now, historically and personally, that was biblically stupid of me to actually be accepting it that way. Because I'm sitting back going, Bull Connor was, what was it again? Oh, that's right. He was the head law enforcement guy in Birmingham. Selma, Alabama, that wasn't a bunch of vigilantes. That was the Alabama State Police waiting on the other side of the bridge. Mississippi burning, I'm pretty sure most of you know what I'm talking about when I say that. There were a bunch of law enforcement officers that actually killed those civil rights workers. So historically, buying into the narrative that the police and law enforcement had always put out there didn't make sense. Personally, it didn't make sense either, because by the time I wrote my first crime story, I'd had a gun pulled on me by cops twice. Once for murder when I was 17, I didn't do it. And the second thing was for an armed robbery that hadn't occurred. Yeah, figure that one out. I got stopped on suspicion of an armed robbery and it hadn't actually happened. So personally and historically, I should have known better, but I accepted those facts because, that's just what we did, because the people that we were hanging out with And I was in my 20s, so give me a little bit of a break. But the people that we were hanging out with and considered to be our best sources were law enforcement. It was the prosecutor's office, because we didn't have, like a neighborhood commission to go to, which would be a place that I would go now first to start getting the feelings for what's happening in the community. So where we would end up was with one side of the story. That changed, and there were a couple of lessons that come in here that not every cop is a bad cop either. But this changed for me in April of 1988, and this is going to be almost a history lesson for you guys. A young man named Loyal Garner Jr. in Sabine Parish, Louisiana, went over to Sabine County in Texas because they were neighboring counties. You just had to cross over a bridge over a place called Toledo Bend. Within a mile of crossing that bridge, the police stopped him. Within an hour, he was in a coma. The police in Sabine Parish called me to tell me I needed to look into it a little bit more deeply because they didn't buy it. So it was police who said, this thin blue line stuff, no, because what happened to this guy was wrong. Now, the official narrative was that Loyal Garner Jr. and the Maxey brothers had gotten pulled over, taken in, they were belligerent, they were fighting and wouldn't comply. And Loyal Garner Jr. then attacked the police at the jail, and they were trying to subdue him. They said he was so strong that we couldn't do anything with him. Like, look, Loyal was probably strong, but he was 5'7", maybe 150. Tommy Ladner, who was the police chief in Hemp Hill, who somehow managed to be riding with the sheriff's department, was my height and 50 pounds bigger than me, which would have put him at 6'5", 300 pounds. And then there were two other officers. So the narrative didn't really work all that well when you started looking at the facts and you started digging on the facts. But the initial narrative was one all of you've actually heard, which was he wouldn't comply and he was strong and he was a superhuman strength. Yeah, that's what they said about Rodney King too. So we started digging around. And by the way, in that particular trial in Hemp Hill, Texas, they were found not guilty. The thing that saved the case, though, was they sent Loyal Garner Jr. to Tyler, Texas for medical care, and he died there. So another county had jurisdiction in the case, too. And that's how they got convicted, because they brought instead of a murder case, they brought a civil rights violation case. And at that time, Texas was semi-sane, and you could actually do things like that. The lesson that I got there, and once again, the sheriff of that particular county, he also was straightforward and talked. And he testified against his officers. So I couldn't actually just put all the officers in one big bucket and say, hey, everybody's bad, because it was officers that had actually allowed me to break a story that then turned into, this conviction and justice for this particular family. But what it showed me was maybe you need to stop listening to the official narrative you get first. Maybe you need to start talking to people and hearing more about what's going on. So the next set of stories that we did was to actually start talking to people whose loved ones had died in jails along the border between Louisiana and Texas. And it was real interesting. It's not going to surprise you, but the narrative that you got from the families of how people managed to kill themselves in jails was totally different than what the police got. So the next lesson was FOIA the hell out of everything you can. Start going after all of the medical reports, because a lot of times it didn't feel like they had actually lined up to where they would get together and do a huddle yet. Now, sometimes it feels like all of them are talking to each other now. if there's anything that I would say is different. But back then, you had medical examiners that would look at you and tell the truth and go, no, that's not what happened. Well, why didn't you say that when they did the report where they said he hung himself with a pair of blue jeans or with his underwear by sitting on the floor on his 5-inch bunk? Nobody asked. So FOIA'd all the reports. These days, I would simply tell you, FOIA everything you can for any video and for body cameras. That's the first thing that I do. Were there body cameras? Well, then I'm going to FOIA them. One of the best stories we've got was Ronald Green in Louisiana, where the state police's rendition of the facts in Louisiana was that this gentleman was fighting them and everything else. And then when you see the video, you're going, that ain't what happened. So, you can just go look for Ronald Green, and the reporter's name's Jim Mustian, because at the time Jim worked for me. So then we got to Rodney King, and the video came out. So we're all going, all right, now that we got video, people in the neighborhood, especially people of color, have actually been saying this stuff's been happening to them for years, but none of us was listening until that video came out. And then they were found not guilty. Now, when I ended up in LA, I didn't actually go down to the police station to talk to the police about what was going on. I actually went out in South Central, and strangely enough, my first trip to LA, I sat down with a bunch of gang members at the Imperial Courts. And they knew more about what was happening in the neighborhood and what kind of interactions they were having with law enforcement than anybody else. So my next lesson was find the people in the neighborhood that are going to tell you the other side of the story. Because they're gang members. Yeah, they're also human beings too. And the interesting thing about the guys in Imperial Courts, when I got there, they weren't kids. They were my age. They were young men in their 30s. They had families. They were trying to work, and they were saying, like, look, we've been telling people forever that what we are dealing with is injustice. And at some point, when you're dealing with injustice every day, you stop complying, because if you figure, even if I comply, I'm going to end up dead. Well, hell, most people are going to fight for their lives. So that was kind of the narrative that started then. Then for me, it's a matter of, I took all that, and then pretty much every story that I've done since then, it's a matter of the data is there. If you don't think that there's a little bit of a problem when it comes to race and our criminal justice system, I wouldn't use the FBI uniform crime reports, because we all know that those have never really had full compliance in terms of the departments turning in their data. Like, for instance, everybody would do these giant rankings, and then you realize New York and LA were missing. So some of the largest cities were missing from their data. But the ones that you can check is like the prison census. Those numbers are accurate. So if you look at those numbers and you say, okay, so young black men are 6% of the population, but they're 51% of the prison population, that ain't a lot. That's not really a number that you can argue with. So then the next question has to become for you, so why is the forget about disproportionality. It's a raw number that's straight up. And I think that happened for the first time in 1995, 1996, where the number of black men in prison outnumbered white men for the first time. Yeah, probably 95, 96. I know it was in the 1990s. Disproportionately, it is still nuts. Even though it might float back and forth and you might have more white guys kind of get arrested and go to prison now, But the commonality there for everybody is they're all poor. That's another way to do the story. And to do stories, because if you deal with it from an economic standpoint, you're going to cover the racial aspect of it too. I just did a story, and hopefully there'll be like a handout or something, but I did a story last week. And the story that I did was on what I call escape velocity. And it's the things that have to go right in your life if you are born in a certain class of this caste system that we have in America for you to get out of it. You can get out of it, but it's like a moonshot. There are 3 million parts that got to work together and all work right. The lead of my story was a young man that was killed. Well, he was the first death, the violent death in my hometown of Alexandria, Louisiana. I could tell his full story because he was my first cousin, and I tried to adopt him when he was 13 because his mom had been murdered, to try to get him out of there. And he was 34 when he was killed. I can't tell you as I sit here, what the outcomes would have been. But I can tell you, I think I might have given him more options. Now, the data that I used in that story is a fantastic data set that they've got up at Harvard. It's called, the Opportunity Index. And they do all kind of studies. And what I found in there was, okay, if you were born poor in America, if you're born poor and Black in America, only 2% of the children, and they've done this by following thousands of people, only 2% of the children who are born in the lowest quintile, who are Black, will make it to the highest quintile. For white kids, it's 10%. What's more likely is for 74% of all Black kids born in the lowest quintile will only move up at best 1. That means you got no margin for error. Now, shockingly enough, for white kids, it's 54% are still in the same boat. So when you look at that and you look at the crime reporting you're doing and criminal justice involvement, more than half of the white kids born poor are going to stay poor too. When you start looking at our whole numbers and our whole system that way, you start actually understanding why our system breaks down the way that it does. I also suggest another data set is go do the criminal justice expenditure census. We spend $310 billion a year on criminal justice. What's the industry? It's humans. You need the raw material. If you start looking at it as an industry, it changes the way you see the bodies and the folks that are actually going in. Us as journalists, we have to actually, like I said, we have to kind of get out of the buckets that we've been in and start looking at it from an economic standpoint and the racial perspective. But we also have to actually understand that everybody's not going to see and write the same stuff that we do. So what I have tried to do, and when I was at Wall Street Journal, I was trying to write the stories on the arrests and Black guys going to prison. My editor wasn't interested in it. So the story I ended up doing, where I could then do the racial aspect of it too, was you do realize 40% of all white guys have been arrested too, between the ages of 30 and younger. And the story ended up being America has a rap sheet. That was the headline. That was actually my lead. And then I got into, because basically what it meant was if you got arrested, there was a database where the FBI was holding on to all these records forever. And while that wasn't as much of a problem early on, in the 60s and 70s, it's a problem now because you got everything that's electronic. I can find any record that I want. And there are employees and employers that are actually doing these same kind of things. So one of the women that I used was this beautiful elderly Black woman who was in Maryland, who had worked for the local state government for 30 years, retired, and decided she wanted to work as a cafeteria worker. They turned her down because she was with a woman who had shoplifted here in Philly in '61. This was 2014. And that record was still on file here, enough to actually scuttle a 70-something-year-old woman from being able to hand out hash browns and chicken nuggets in a school cafeteria. That's how I got to tell that story. So you can cover the race aspect with the voices that you're actually using. And think about the voices that you're using in your stories. Now, the positive part to that was once I actually did the story, people got so embarrassed up here, they expunged her record. But it was too late for her to actually get the job. We did stories on, on regulations and on, even at the federal level, on too many arrests and over arresting people. And the story and the person that I used, Lawrence Lewis, was a janitor at a retirement home for retired military officers who unclogged a toilet. Didn't have anything to do with how it was designed, where the pipes ran or anything else, but it ran into a stream that ran into a creek, that ran into a creek, that ran into a creek, that probably a day later then emptied into the Potomac River. And he got prosecuted by a federal prosecutor for a waterway, for a navigable waterway violation. The man was in his 60s and got a federal crime attached to him because of that. Needless to say, that was one of those rare opportunities where when I got to do that story, Republicans, Democrats, Russians, Americans, everybody screamed about it because it was that stupid. And it was all about picking and getting the right narrative to actually carry your data. And then the data you wrap around it, which is how much this actually happens to everybody. It's about the images that you use. And there are so many places that you can go to. Like I said, the Brennan Center is fantastic in terms of looking at things. The Collateral Consequences Center is fantastic, especially now. Margie Love was a former pardon attorney for the Department of Justice. They keep up with all the collateral consequences. And the collateral consequences are not minuscule consequences anymore. They're costing people jobs. They cost you your ability to vote at a time when Lord knows everybody needs to vote. So go into that because she's got maps and those kinds of things. So there are these data sites all over the place. There is data for everything these days that you can look at that will then support whatever the work is that you're doing. But remember, everybody doesn't look like you. And one of the things I remember most was, and I'm going to say this, diversity to me isn't just this. It's this and this. I need diversity of the mind in my newsrooms. And diversity of the heart. I need people to sit down and acknowledge, maybe I can't see the world the way you do, but I'm going to respect that you see it the way you do. And I'm going to listen to you as you actually explain it. Because otherwise, when we sit around in those news meetings, there was one place I worked, and I'm not going to name it, but everybody had actually gone to the same universities. And they'd grown up the same. So when they looked at each other and they saw a story, they all thought the same story was a good story. Well, yeah, you came from the same experiences. you're going to see the same things. I'm a black dude who was homeless with his mom as a baby from Louisiana. I see the world a little different, except when I have the stupidity of not actually realizing, historically, that I shouldn't have actually been buying into everything cops said. So, I don't have any fantastic ideas or thoughts to actually give you other than to be open to other stories, be open to going places that make you uncomfortable. I was the Ku Klux Klan reporter for my paper in Louisiana. I dare you to top that. I absolutely, and I have pictures on my phone to prove it. I got medallions. The Grand Dragon became my pen pal because I covered one of their parades. So if I can go to Klan cross burnings and some of the other places I've been, I suspect there's not too many places that are going to make you guys more uncomfortable. And you got to be prepared to be uncomfortable. That's why you came into the business. Now, I came in because I thought because I thought I could actually do good for people by telling the stories that other people don't tell and by seeing the people other people don't see. So I feel like I've actually kept the faith when it comes to that. And all of you probably have these noble ideas and reasons for why you came to do this business. So.
Hello, my name's Anita. I'm from Temple. I have a quick question. So, as you guys referenced, Rodney King was in the 1990s, and more recently is George Floyd. Now, the minority has always known these stories, have always said these stories, but have not actually been able to have the voice until recently when, the curtains have fallen. And then we've also talked about how we got our source for the story from the police until we realized that there may be more to it than just what they're saying. So the question is, what are we doing when it comes to stories? Aside, I know, the answer is talk to other people, talk to community members, but I still find that in news reports, there's still a lot of stories are using the law enforcement as a pure source or the majority of the source or whatever it is. So what are we doing in that circumstance to not let that happen? And racism, as you guys know, is still very out there. It's at every news source. So I guess my thing is, how is it that, what can we do so that every 20 years or so, we don't have to have a violent crime happen to someone so people could have sympathy and report what is actually out there instead of the sensationalized reports?
You want to take it or you want me to?
You go first.
All right. First off, the way I would deal with and the way I deal with it is it depends on the situation, because there are some things that even the police can tell the truth about. It's the things that turn toward them where you need to start asking questions as soon as, did you have body cams? If so, I want the video. If not, why not? If you had it on and I can actually go research whether or not your department's got body cams, you turned it off, then those are the kind of things that you can report. They were wearing body cams, but for that moment when they were beating the hell out of the guy, it malfunctioned. So there are things that you can actually do to question that and to kind of keep the heat on. And then to also go to the council members and the other folks who actually deal with their budgets to ask questions. So that's one thing, because unfortunately it's not every 20 years, it's every 20 months, really. I mean, I look at the video of Tamar Rice and think about what that narrative was, and then you look at the video going, no, he was 12 and he looked 12. So to me, those are the things that you have to kind of keep doing, and you have to actually be knowledgeable. And I think everybody in here is knowledgeable enough now to know. For years, we got taken because we bought the narrative. I don't think any of us buys the narrative anymore. I think we're actually all just a little suspicious of the narrative. If I pull up on the scene now and the officer says it's Tuesday, I'm going to say, are you sure? So it's just to be just a little bit suspicious.
I would add to that when we were having a collaborative session earlier, I think it was this table that had the question of like, why are we like more readily trusting the information of police than community? I love that question. I think that it's so important for us to make space for those questions and peel back the onion on how the power dynamics and the hierarchies in our society impact us as journalists and impact who we trust and who we go to and who we present information for as verifiable to our communities. That's so important that we continue to have this conversation. So I think this table, right, was already starting to do that work. And that many of us here are trying to do that work. I think we have to keep it going. If you are a news reporter and you have a source that lies to you repeatedly, if you don't stop talking to them, your editor gonna make you stop talking to them. And you are not allowed to treat them as a reliable source. And if you are forced to quote them, you might even have to take time and talk to multiple editors about how you actually inform the public that that person has given unreliable information in the past. It don't work that way with police. Police lie to journalists all day, every day. That's come up today too, multiple times. We don't caution the public when we breathlessly publish police information unvetted. We just don't. And I think that we have to ask more critical questions about why we operate that way with them and what fourth estate lapse is happening when that happens and what lapse is happening just period, right? And yeah, I think that we have to push ourselves. We've normalized a lot in our industry and take it as, oh, this is how we do it. But I think that deep down, so many of us know that there's better ways to do it. I think that we have to strive for how do we make the better ways to do it more possible.
Ted Guest from Criminal Justice Journalist. I have a general question about when should we be identifying the race of people in crime stories? I know that's a very broad question. We have unfortunately, a whole series of police shootings in which we all, I mean, I include myself in this, typically will say a white police officer shot a black man. Should we, as journalists, automatically include the race of people in crime stories, just like forever we've included the age? Someone was 43 years old, or what guidelines would you offer on that?
Me personally, I think if you consistently did it for everybody, then that would actually take and remove from that the idea that we might be using our own prejudices when we put it in or we put it out because we're trying to actually prove a point or we're trying to incite anger or whatever in it. If you do it for everybody, to me, that would actually make it a whole lot easier.
For me, there's a question that precedes that question, and I respect Gary's answer, which is like, are we actually sitting with the reality that for so long, if you wrote man, you were talking about a white man, you weren't talking about a person of color, that like you would call that person a colored man or a Negro or someone Latin. You wouldn't actually necessarily call everybody a man. You wouldn't call everybody a woman. And today, we do call people across races, men and women, non-binary folk. We do that. But there still is sort of like a vestigial legacy of that, where like, even if you're writing just like a cute weekend story, you'll just call somebody a black man. You'll just call somebody by their race. And you won't necessarily call someone white that. someone white in print is not automatically a white man. They're not like, it's not like, oh, I interviewed this white doctor. But you might say I interviewed a black doctor on this issue, right? I think that we have to actually hold that and unpack that some when we have this conversation as well too.